Do you have a large collection of charm packs just like I do? Well, if you do, this will be a fun video for you because I'm going to show you how to use just one charm pack and make an adorable quilt. For this pattern, you will also need some background fabric. I'm choosing to use some black tone on tone here. You're going to want about a yard of background fabric if you just want to make the quilt top without the border. If you would like to add on the border, you'll need about a yard and a half of fabric. I'm going to use 3 different half-yard cuts of tone on tone black fabric. This is fabric that I got from a So Yeah live sale here on YouTube. I love watching their live fabric sales and getting some great deals on fabric. Now, the charm pack fabric that I'm using is Free Spirit Tula Pink, and this is the True Colors Fairy Dust Charm Pack. All right, so the first thing we're going to do for this quilt is open up our charm pack and sort through our fabrics. I'm actually just going to quickly divide mine into like the sort of pinks and oranges, the yellows, the blues, the purples. I'm gonna add this in with the purples. And then my kind of lighter whites here. So a lot more of these. It's a good thing I used black as the background here because there's a lot of white fabrics. Tula Pink often has very bright colors, and I think they really pair well with black quite often. All right, so what I'm gonna do here is lay out a nice variety of these colors in rows of 8. So there's going to be 8 of these charm squares in a row, and I'm going to have 5 rows that I sew together. So I'm just going to lay these out in a nice variety that I like. So I'm going to start with a pink, and I need 8 in this row. I'll throw a yellow. Definitely have to get some of these lighter ones worked in because we're going to need a lot of them. 6. I might put one at the beginning too. Here and then. So the nice thing with this pattern is that the next row isn't going to be right next to this one, so it doesn't matter if some of the colors match up. So as long as you like your row, it's good to go. So I like this row. I'm going to take the first square, stack it on the second, and just keep doing that down the row. And then I'm going to put a marker on it that lets me know this is my row 1. All right, so I set the first row to the side, and I'm just going to do that 4 more times to get 5 rows. Then I have row 2. So after I get all these rows laid out the way I like them, I'm going to head over to the sewing machine and show you how to sew them all together. Now, you are going to have 2 charm squares left over here. That is okay. I am going to show you how to add those into the border so you don't have any fabric left behind. All right, so I have row 1 here, and I have rows 2 through 5 next to me so I can sew those as well. You can chain piece all the rows at once if you would like, starting with the first 2 in row 1. Keep that string together and move to row 2. I prefer to work rows like this one at a time just so I can stay organized and make sure everything's lined up the way I intended. But of course, piece them however you feel comfortable. All right, so I'm going to set my marker to the side, and I'm going to start with the square that is on top, and I'm going to lay that down. I need to turn on the sewing machine. I just realized I don't have it on. Okay, so I'm going to lay the first square in the row next to me, and then I like to move the pile over toward my right. That just helps me remember that this is the square that goes on next. I need to move this a little out of the way. So I have the first one down, and this is the second one in row 1. I'm going to lay it right sides together. Now, what's always fun here and always up for debate is where to sew on these pre-cuts that have the pinked edges. Do you sew at the peak of the pinked edges or the valley? You can always measure the square and see where that 5-inch lines up. Does it line up at the peak or does it line up at the valley? And that will help you know where to sew, especially if the end result matters for your pattern. So if you're using a specific pattern and this square needs to come out to a specific size for everything to line up right, it's very important. For this pattern, it isn't that important because there's no specific size we're looking for at the end result. So I'm just going to sew along the valley. It's easier for me to line up the edge of my presser foot there. So that's where I'm going to line up, and I'm just going to try to keep that consistent with all of my fabrics. I have my, whatever I was sewing last, I had my stitch length up at 3, so I need to turn that down. I'm just a little bit not prepared today, but this is going to turn out great either way. Now, I'm going to finger press this however way the seam's just wanting to lay right now, and then I'm going to press it with heat later. The thing with this pattern is the next row is always going to be a solid strip, so the seams don't matter here, which is great. We don't have to line up any seams. I bet you love hearing that, don't you? Whenever I have a pattern where I don't have to worry about the direction I press my seams and everything's just going to be okay either way, I am on board. So I'm sewing that 1/4-inch seam right next to the valley. Just going to finger press my seam over. It's just going to help it lay nicely whenever I go to press. So I'm just going to grab the next square and put it on. This is so simple, fun, simple sewing. I love this type of sewing because this is the type of sewing I can do while I listen to an audiobook I love, a podcast I love, or watch a TV show or a movie while I sew. Well, don't normally get to watch, I just listen, but either way, this type of easy sewing is so fun for me. It's the perfect type of sewing to do between a big project when you just want to sew and get something finished. All right, so just going to keep sewing these on until I get to the final one, which is the 8th square for this row. All right, so here's the first row all finished. So I'm going to take that marker I set aside and I'm just going to pin it to the first square in that row. So just in case these get laid out different later, I'll know what the first square is, what the first row is. Just so that I can keep it lined up the way I intended. So I'm going to get all these rows sewn together and then I'll show you what we do next. And it's so simple. You're going to love this quilt. Now that all of the rows are sewn together, I'm going to show you how to cut each row. We're going to start with row 1. All right, so I have row 1 here and I'm going to set the marker to the side. And what we're going to do is cut this into 1-inch strips. Because this is 5 inches, we're going to cut it into 5 1-inch strips. Now that can be a little bit of a daunting task. I understand that it is a small cut, but I think it's going to be worth it, and this will be a fun way to practice those smaller cuts and sewing together strips with smaller cuts. So I'm going to lay the row nice and flat. And I'm going to get, all right, so I'm going to lay out the 1-inch mark along here. And the nice thing on a ruler is you can line up some additional lines too where you have them to make sure you're nice and straight. So once I get it lined up the best I can, I'm not going for perfect. I never go for perfect. I go for close, perfect-ish. So I got the 1 inch lined up with my lined ruler. Then I have my slide lock at that 1 inch mark, and I'm gonna press down on it so it holds in place nice and steady, and then I'm gonna make my cut. All right, because I couldn't cut all the way across it and I didn't want to fold it over here to try to cut it, I just don't like doing that. If I don't have to, I don't fold over. So I have that cut, and I'm going to move this down and then cut through the rest of these. So I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to line up, try to get it very, very straight. Use my ruler to line up along that 1 inch mark. Got some wonky sewing here, so I'm just going to try to line it up the best I can. And I'm going to finish cutting that 1 inch mark through. Right, so I'm going to set that to the side, and then I'm going to keep doing that till I get all 5 of those cuts. All right, so I have all 5 of my strips cut from that row 1 we sewed together. I'm going to set them to the side. I'll show you what to do with them later, but we need to do a few more cuts. All right, so I have row 2 and 3 here, and we're just going to cut these in half. So much easier cuts. We're just going to cut them into 2.5 inch strips. So we'll end up with 4 2.5 inch strips. All right, so just like with before, I'm gonna lay these out, and I'm gonna line up the 2.5 inch line along the edge, put my slide lock next to the ruler, press down and cut. All right, and I'm gonna do that one more time to cut through the rest of it. All right, I'm going to set these strips to the side. Now I'm going to cut through row 3 the exact same way. All right, so rows 2 and 3 are now cut in half. So we have 4 2.5 inch strips. I got good news for you. We're not going to be cutting rows 4 and 5, so those are ready to go. All right, so now we're going to cut our background fabric. So I have 3 of my 1/2 yard cuts laid out here, and the first thing I'm going to do is square up one side of them. All right, so now that I have a nice straight edge to work with, I'm going to cut some 1 inch strips. I'm going to need 3 1 inch strips. And this is 1 inch by width of fabric. So I measured 1 inch, and now I'm going to cut the strips. So I have 3 1 inch strips now, and I need 6 of them. So I'm going to cut a 1 inch strip again. All right, so now I have 6 1 inch strips. I'm going to set those to the side. Now I'm going to cut 4 2.5 inch strips. So I removed one of the layers of fabric. I just have 2 here now. So now I have 2 2.5 inch strips. And then I'm going to do that again to get 4 2.5 inch strips. All right, so here are my 4 2.5 inch strips that I'm going to set to the side. And now I'm going to cut 2 5 inch strips. All right, so I'm going to line up the 5 inch marking and cut my final 2 strips. All right, so there are my two 5-inch strips that I'm going to set to the side. And I have a bit of fabric left over that I'm going to set to the side for my border that I'm going to add on later. All right, so the next thing you're going to want to do is measure your rows that you sewn together before. So make sure they're all about the same length. Mine are about 37 inches. Once you get that measurement for what your strips are, you might want to cut your background fabric down to that size. It'll make things easier for you when you piece this quilt together. To make this easier for me, since all of my strips, my background fabric strips, are folded in half, I divided 37 inches by 2. That is 18.5. It makes it easier for me to lay these out on my mat. So I have one side over at the 0 marking, and then I have these laying out across a line. So all I'm going to do once I get it lined up is cut across at the 18.5-inch mark. And I'll set this fabric aside in my scrap bin. Now, if you would prefer laying it out straight and cutting it, definitely do that. But since these are all folded, I thought this would be a lot easier for me. Okay, now we have everything cut, so it's time to make our quilt top. So you're going to start with your background fabric 1-inch strip, and then you're going to go in with one of your print fabrics. And remember, this is all from the same charm. So they could all look the same if you laid them out the same direction. So let me flip this and show you. But every other one I flip so that it looks just a little bit different. You have the same charm pack, but if you flip it, you get that different pattern through here. And it really makes it just a little bit more interesting than if they're all laid out in the same direction. So you're going to alternate a background, print, background, print, background, print, background, print, background, print, and background. And look here how each of my background look just a little bit different. They're all black, but they're a tone on tone design, and they're all a little bit different. Well, 3 of them. But I alternated them, so it just adds a little bit more interest to this strip set. All right, so I have this laid out, and I'm going to move it to the side. Just going to lay them in order that I'm going to sew them. I love stacking. Did you notice? These are a little hard to stack since they're such tiny little strips. And now, since we ended that last strip set with a background fabric, this one we're going to start with prints. And we're going to lay out the prints, and then we're going to lay out the background fabric, and that's going to match in size. Now, I'm going to make sure this one is flipped, but since we use 2 different strip sets, I'm actually going to go ahead and lay a different one here from a different row, just because it'll really make this a little more different through here and add a little more interest. And this is from our first one, our first charm square, but I'm going to turn it and lay it this way. Then add background fabric, prints, and background fabric. We're getting off camera here, but you move it up so you can see a little bit more. Kind of that same layout design, just with wider, wider strips here. So I'm going to lay this out so I can sew it together. Stack them. All right, and I'm going to lay this by the sewing machine to sew together. And then we have our final 2. We have row 4 that we sewed. Lay out some background fabric. And then we're going to end with some background fabric. All right, and so I'm going to stack these and set them by the sewing machine. And so to finish off the main part of this quilt top, we're just going to sew all those strips together. Okay, so let's finish up this quilt top. I'm going to start with those 1-inch strips. And if you want to here, pin the heck out of these, because we all know sewing long strips together can get really wonky. I'm gonna wing it here and I might regret it, but that's just how I'm gonna roll today. I'm gonna keep it simple. Now, because these are really thin little strips, I'm gonna secure them a little bit on the ends and do a few back stitches. And then I'm just going to make sure they stay lined up together. I'm gonna kind of hold them together up by me. Don't pull them because you cut these strips from those charm pack rows and you don't know how secure those seams are until they get tacked down by sewing these rows together. So I'm just going to stop every now and then, adjust, make sure everything's lining up nicely. And the beauty here is if measured wrong, cut wrong, any of those things, we can trim up this quilt at the end if we need to. All right, and it looks like I was off a little bit on my measuring, probably by about 1/2 inch. I'm not even gonna worry about it. We're gonna just ignore that. And I'm gonna press this seam. I'm gonna finger press it just to get it moving how I'm going to press it later. I'm pressing toward the background fabric. I think that'll just make it a little bit easier to do it that way, because there's no bulky seams on that side from all of the charm squares being sewn together. So after I finger press against there and get it moving in the right direction for pressing later, I'm going to sew on that next background strip. So I'm just going to work through here sewing all of these 1-inch strips together in order. And then after I finish all of the 1-inch strips, I'm going to move on to the 2.5-inch strips and then move on to those 5-inch strips, just working in order. It's really easy sewing right here. Just look at how that Tula fabric really pops against that black. Right, so I'm just gonna keep adding on these strips. All right, so here is the quilt top with the first layer of strips on. Oh my goodness, it is looking so good. So now I'm just going to start in with the 2.5-inch strips. So I'm just going to lay my first strip right sides together along one of the 1-inch background strips and sew across there and just work through the 2.5-inch strips the same way. So after sewing on this strip, I'm going to sew on a 2.5-inch background strip. All right, so that one's sewn on, and now I'm going to sew on the background strip. All right, so I'm gonna just keep sewing through all these strips. So here is my quilt all finished. And I'm going to walk you through how I finished this quilt. First, I added 2.5-inch strips to the sides of this quilt and the top of the quilt to add a border to it. I didn't add that 2.5-inch strip to the bottom of the quilt because it already had a fairly thick background border on it, and I didn't want to add too much more of this black fabric to the bottom of the quilt. Then you can see a little pop of color along the corners here. I wanted to use up those 2 leftover charm squares on the edges of the border because I thought it would really add a little really beautiful accent along the edge, and I love how it turned out. So how I did that was I cut the 2 leftover charms I had in half, giving me 2.5-inch strips, and then I cut those in half again. Now I decided to add the strips onto the sides of the quilt first. So I needed to measure the length of the quilt. That measurement for me was 43 inches. So to figure out what length I needed to cut my background strip to here, I subtracted 10 inches from 43 inches. So where did I come up with that 10-inch amount? Well, both of my charm strips that are going to be on the ends of that strip are 5 inches. So that brings me to cutting the strip to 33 inches. However, don't forget that we need to add in some seam allowance. So I added 1 inch to that 33 inch and I cut my strips down to 34 inches. I sewed 2 of my charm strips to each end of that strip, pressed the seams, and then sewed 1 onto each side of the quilt. Now you can see that that accent is different in each corner, and on the diagonal they are the same. So just be careful with the placement of those strips if you're wanting yours to look similar to mine. Now, after getting those thin border strips sewn onto each side of the quilt, I needed to measure the quilt again to get the width of the quilt. And I went through those same steps as before to figure out what I needed to cut my background fabric strip to. So the strips are 1 1/4 inch. I just needed to figure out how long to cut them. The width of my quilt was 41 3/4 of an inch. I subtracted 10 from that again because that is what the length of 2 of my charm strips are. So that gives me 31 3/4 of an inch. And then to adjust for seam allowances, I added 1 inch. So I cut those strips for the top and the bottom of my quilt to 32 3/4 of an inch. So after I got those strips sewn onto all sides, finishing with the top strip and the bottom strip, I pressed them really well and was ready to baste my quilt. Now, here is something fun to let you know. I had this really pretty pink fabric here for the back of this quilt, and I didn't quite have enough of the fabric, so embrace the backing overage. If you don't think you have enough backing fabric or it's really close, don't always trust that you'll baste really well. I really thought I could, and I had one corner here that didn't have backing cover it. So I decided to just fix it. I had already quilted the entire quilt and trimmed it up when I noticed it, and I decided to just add some of the leftover fabric there. I hand stitched it on, making sure to go just through the strip I'm using to cover that missed area. And yeah, I just sewed it on And it actually turned out fine here. I just wrote on it like I meant for it to be, a label on the back of the quilt, trimmed this up again, and then added on the binding and made it work. So just remember, if you have some mistakes in your quilt, you can often always fix them. Nobody's gonna ever know what happened there. Well, now they will because I told everyone, but more than likely nobody's gonna know that something like that was because there was a mistake with the backing fabric. So here is the quilt again, all finished. Absolutely love how this turned out. A lot brighter than a lot of the quilts I make, but Tula Pink fabric is so fun. If you want a nice, bright, cheerful quilt, definitely look for some Tula. All right, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.